make it just thicker by putting more layers at the bottom. So you've got a thick chunk at the bottom, you know?
Yeah, and they modeled that. This was a passive house, so they had to model all of these things, and they modeled it and found out that it works just fine.
That is so awesome. I love science. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, a regular discussion about building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Rob Watzak, Digital Brand Manager.
Hello.
Brian Pontalillo, Editorial Director.
Hey, everyone.
And our producer, Jeff Rose.
Howdy.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Hey, it's good to see you guys. What have you been up to? Rob, you go first. It looks like you've been digging around your landscape.
Oh, man. So this time of year, when it just starts to get a little warm and sunny outside, much to my family's dismay, is if I'm in the middle of an interior remodeling project, I'm like, I'd rather go out and do something in the garden today. So now I've got like twice as many projects in the works. So you remember last year, I found that free stone wall in my neighborhood that I took like 5 truckloads of stone to my house. So now I'm finally getting to use some of that rock. And there's a little path that goes down towards the river in my backyard that
it's a really steep slope, right? And you're doing some terracing, right?
Well, so the stone walls I'm building are just out of, just like that field stone, kind of rough stone that I have lying around. And they're not structural. They're not holding back the earth so much. They're more just sort of shaping the landscape a little bit more subtly. And the main reason why I put that little wall in is because I've got some of those hog panels, those like heavy gauge. It's almost like hardware cloth, but like rigid heavy gauge panels that you see on farms, on gates. And I've been using those as a temporary gate, but I'm actually on one portion of my property going to be running them almost like fencing. And because they don't slope, I had to bring the grade up to sort of match the panel as opposed to trying to slope the panel, which would look wonky. So I'm doing a bunch of these little stone walls, basically just to create level planes that the bottom of the fence contacts so that my dog can't sneak under the fence.
Cool. It looks like a heck of a lot of work, brother.
It's one of my favorite things to do. It's like very meditative to just sit with a pile of stone and just sort of look for the next piece that's going to fit into the little puzzle. And, honestly, it's not like if I use my hand truck or my wheelbarrow to sort of dump a pile on the ground next to me, I'm not doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's just sort of dragging the stones around. So it's surprisingly, I felt pretty good the next day. Usually I'm all creaky after doing some heavy work, but it was all right.
Brian, can I assume that you would find that a therapeutic experience and enjoyable?
Well, absolutely. And I actually did that kind of work, for a living at times. And Rob said something interesting, and I can't say that I ever got really good, really skilled. And we're talking about field stone walls that are common in New England. And so I did work for a little while in the Midwest where they use a lot of quarried stone, and that's a whole nother type of thing. Because the stone tends to be more rectilinear, right? And field stone tends to be more irregular. But one of the things I noticed as I would be working with people who were much more skilled at building dry walls than I was, and it relates to what Rob just said, is that I would spend time trying to pick a stone that fit, and a really skilled mason makes whatever stone they grab work. I didn't see the really good masons.
But they're picking. They're not just
stones down and trying another one.
They just knew exactly what would work.
They eyed something, and then maybe they had to hammer a little node off of it or something, but then they made it work. Yeah. I would spend more time. I would try 3 stones for one spot. They would pick up one.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I worked for my uncle when I was in college, and he and his partner did a lot of stone walls. And one day I was working on the job site, and they basically told me after that day that I had to stop building stone walls because the owner liked my rough-looking wall better than their really tidy wall. And but yeah, it's like, I wonder, I don't have the patience and I don't really feel the need to make those really tidy walls because I like this. Growing up in New England, I'm used to seeing those old farmers' walls.
Which are piles of stones. Let's be just clear. That's like they would just throw them at the edge of the field so they didn't hit them with a plow.
Yeah, and in some parts of my yard, I take a little extra time, and I do often use a hammer and chisel to sort of make them the rocks work the way I want them to. But in this case, it was just a fun, relaxing project, and I've gotten pretty good at like eyeing the pile and knowing which stone is going to work, and then just shifting things around as I find other little pieces to fill in the gaps.
Jeff, have you done any stone? Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say the most important thing, I think, in terms of aesthetics is using a string line and a level and making sure that the wall is straight. If it's meant to be a straight wall, that it actually is straight and that all the stones are in plane, both along the length of the wall and vertically. And that will, even if you're not so skilled at making everything fit tightly, that will make the wall look neat. As opposed to like, if you get little waves in the wall, if the stones aren't in plane, it looks messy fast.
Yeah, and if even if every single rock face isn't in plane, because that starts getting to look really like controlled. As long as you have dominant lines in certain planes of rocks, I think that's key.
Jeff, have you done any stone masonry? Does it appeal to you?
I have done some. It's not my favorite pastime, but I have.
Yeah, I like lighter hobbies. Yeah. I've been working on using up my pile of accumulated building materials. I built a cabinet on my deck that is meant to house the 5-gallon gas cans that I bought for my filling my generator. And, you either have gas or you have cans all the time now. And I have petroleum products in my workshop. And now when I heat the place, it starts to smell like gasoline. And I really want to get all that stuff out of here because I don't think it's good for you. So I built this cabinet on my deck from surplus material. And you guys probably saw that in the podcast assets folder. But the siding, which forms what will be doors, came from cutting out the window opening in my lean-to to add 3 windows. And the rest of the pressure-treated lumber was just stuff that was piled under my deck that I had left over from other projects. So it has delighted me to use this stuff and put it to good use. And if you guys see, there's one final picture in there that shows the leftover things I now have, and I need to build something from that very collection, a collection of very random things, and I'll be all done with my stuff.
Patrick, that doesn't sound like a fire-safe cabinet to be storing fuel in.
What do you do, though? I mean, like, you think I need to weld up a steel cabinet? I'm going to have Rob Watsack come over and build a steel cabinet inside my wood cabinet.
Yeah, and we're going to have what has to be like a certain distance from the property line and the building and all that sort of thing. No, I mean, I don't know. So I wonder about gas cans. Like, I mean, obviously, most of them are just sort of stuck inside your grill and people have them close to their houses. So I don't really know where the safety rules are there. Maybe we should look it up.
It should be in an outbuilding is my assumption. So I made one. Unfortunately, it's attached to the main building.
Yeah.
I bought big strap hinges from Amazon. And it's odd to me, like, why are strap hinges always colonial in their design? Like, what the heck is up with that? Like, why are they all wrought iron and ugly?
I mean, I guess that's because that's really sort of where that style of hinge in our country at least came from. It's funny. Sometimes I think that everything from the 18th century was crude, but then you got to think that it was crude in colonial America. It wasn't crude in Europe, necessarily. So I don't know.
If anyone out there has seen good-looking long strap hinges with a more modern aesthetic, I would love to know about them because it doesn't seem like there's a whole bunch of options. Jeff, what have you been working on?
Just a little spring cleanup, exciting things like that. Sweeping the 1/2 inch of salty gravel out of the garage.
Out of the lawn. Yeah. How about you, Brian? What are you up to?
Been continuing to look at houses and properties and feeling really fortunate to have the luxury of some time with this decision. Made offers on 2 properties recently and full price offers, and both were but in both properties I was outnumbered. So I don't know, maybe to my realtor's dismay, I have yet to be willing to go over the asking price, which seems to be about where the value of the home is. So kind of continuing that search. And I have started to consider property, although that seems less likely decision to make.
It's harder to buy raw land, right?
You mean in terms of what's available or the process?
Or financing?
Yeah. So if you have I don't know too much about the process yet. I just kind of started to get into it. But, if you need to get a construction loan, then you'd have to have to know that you were going to get the construction loan for that property. You'd have to, have the plans ready to get the construction loan while you were in the due diligence period on the property.
Because they want to have an assumption that the thing is worth what they're loaning you the money to build, right?
Right.
Yep. Or you could do it the way that I hope to do it someday, which is refinance my house to pay for the land in cash, and then just start stockpiling building materials and build a cheap house on it, right?
You could probably steal some stuff out of your existing house before anyone knew it. Just like in the Great Escape, right? You start taking wood out of it.
Your neighbors are going to be really excited about those stockpiles.
Well, no,
I got a real good note.
I'd put up a pole barn first and paint it like camouflage. But no, actually, just recently I was so tempted. There was a beautiful 70s Airstream trailer, 30-foot long, that was completely gutted for $5,000 somewhere local. And I was like, that would, people spend all this money building these super expensive tiny houses. I'm like, $5,000 for an old watertight Airstream with windows and doors, and you build the interior you want. And I think for, $15,000, you got a nice tiny house there that's probably way bigger than any fancy one you had custom built,
And you still have an RV. Like if your tiny house doesn't work out for you, you can use it as an RV like it was meant to be.
Yep.
I have some friends that did their process was to buy the property, build the garage with apartment above, live in the apartment while they built their house, and then have a rental property, a rental asset on their property, which seems like a pretty smart way to go.
And it makes a lot of sense too, because the garage is your workshop and tool storage, right? You can't be taking your tools, and leaving them outside. Yeah, that's the way to go,
smart.
I think.
That's the way to do it, yeah.
So we got a letter from Dan. Dan says, I've been listening to the FHB podcast lately, and I'm getting increasingly frustrated by the discussions you have at the end about workplace safety. I think Dan is talking about the Pro Talk podcast, where one of the things I typically ask people is, do you have injuries or have you seen wacky things on construction sites regarding safety? Many of the speakers on your podcast know what is dangerous and how to mitigate the risk, but nonetheless, they seem to accept that many contractors not follow basic safety practices. In residential home construction, there are no adverse consequences for not following basic safety and OSHA practices. If so, that indicates to me a weak safety culture and insufficient worker education. I am now retired and spent my career working on nuclear power plant modification projects. Now, of course, nuclear power and other large industrial construction projects are a lot different than residential home build. However, I believe many of the lessons I learned in heavy construction industry would be useful to home builders who need to improve their safety culture. So Dan has a list of 7 things here. 1, get over it. Staying safe is nurtured through continued reinforcement of correct behavior. If you're a leader, supervisor, inspector, even customer who respects and values personal safety, you need to speak up, coach, encourage, and enforce safe practices. 2, establish safety requirements for the workplace, usually based on OSHA and manufacturers' requirements. 3, provide orientation to contractors and subs new to your jobs of what is expected and necessary to continue working on your jobs. 4, do not let subs workers continue to work if they don't follow safety requirements after orientation and coaching. Everybody, including me, has lapses, but those who intentionally bypass safe practices and are not correcting their behavior after coaching must be dealt with. 5, everyone in leadership needs to walk the talk to really change the culture. I think, isn't it, walk the walk is the expression? To change the culture. When peer-to-peer coaching is happening unprompted, that indicates to me a strong safety culture. 6, have safety pre-job briefs at the start of each day to highlight the activities to be encountered and the safety precautions expected. 7, mindset. Workers need to realize that all accidents are preventable. Dan. What do you guys think about this? Of course, he's right.
Why do you think our business has that culture of? I mean, is it so the macho attitude? Is it the people who aren't always business people, not really, sort of thinking they want to spend that extra time and money on things that are just an essential part of the business. And it's culture. It's a culture of the business from many, 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 many years. But
in my own defense, that's why I ask people about this, because I think it's important to prevent injury, and people shouldn't be deaf when they've worked a career in the trades at the end of their career, right? Or be missing digits.
Yeah.
And it's a culture, as Rob suggests. Like it's unfortunately what those of us a generation or two ago, like it was just the norm. And I think it's getting better, but we need to change how people think about it. This comes from Doug. Hey gang, I have a suggestion for the person in British Columbia regarding fence post. As a fellow Pacific Northwester in Eugene, Oregon, I have replaced PT posts and repaired a couple of fences on a previously owned property. The pressure treatment seems to merely slow the rotting process. Eventually, the rotting post snaps at grade level, leaving the fence to resemble a drawbridge. The post replacement techniques I have used is digging out the concrete post, replacing the post only, and a hybrid of the two. They are all miserable. On one especially memorable occasion, I dug, chiseled, and cussed out the concrete and rotted post mass, all in heavy, cold rain. We had to keep our 85-pound Malamute contained. Thank goodness for my obsession with Filson clothing. At our current property, we are planning to expand our fenced area. This is supposed to be our forever home, and I do not want to deal with rotted post. My search for a better solution resulted in discovering Postmaster from Master Halco. It's a metal galvanized post designed to be used with wood fencing. I plan to use this product in our upcoming project. Doug, that seems like a great product. I'm curious what it costs, but I think that solves all those problems. Except digging. You still got to dig the hole.
I was thinking about this, and it's actually kind of surprising. I mean, I guess fences have always been just sort of these things that people throw up around their properties, but it's like we put everything else in concrete in the ground with foundations. We don't bury. I mean, yes, there are those wood foundations here and there, but it's like this galvanized steel certainly seems to make sense. Around here, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but some of the old farmhouses around here actually have granite. I mean, usually that was on a wealthier house, but granite posts. But it's like, why don't we see more of that? I know in the UK, it's more common to have concrete fence posts, like for post and rail fences. And I actually found a company in Pennsylvania that sells them. I'll put a link in the notes.
It sounds tough to fasten your wood boards to a concrete fence post.
Well, this was for the post and rail type fences, but I mean, like the metal one, I'm sure has some sort of bracket system. I mean, I would imagine that some of the concrete posts I've seen on these videos in the UK, they're almost like those sound barriers where they have slots in them, and you drop some sort of planks or barriers into the slots between the posts. But
sounds lovely.
But a more practical thing is, Mark Clement wrote for us a little review on that. What do you call it? The post protector. That's that plastic sleeve that you put on pressure treated posts. Because really what causes the posts to rot is microbes at the surface of the soil eating away at the post. So I've had pretty good luck just by putting plenty of gravel, not stone dust, not sand, but gravel that helps drain and keep the organic matter away from the posts.
I think that's a good suggestion too.
And if you're using a PT post and you're cutting it and you stick the cut end in the ground, you have to treat that cut end.
For sure.
It's better to put it up in the air, I would say, and put a little piece of flashing on top, even better, so that end grain doesn't wick water.
Yeah.
But the top of the post is never a problem. It's always at grade, right? That's like that's where it breaks.
Yeah.
Dear Fine Home Dishwashers Podcast, I think they wrote to you, Jeff. This is directly to you. With respect to podcast episodes 332 and 338, the best dishwasher we ever owned happened to be free. Well, I love that. The heating element in our 15-year-old Kenmore dishwasher stopped working early last year, and we seized the opportunity to replace the entire unit. Even knew we were never thrilled with the cleaning ability or noise level of this old dishwasher. As luck would have it, a neighbor was throwing out an 18-month-old all-stainless KitchenAid dishwasher that looked brand new. It still had the original Sears outlet tag attached. I hauled it into our garage and painstakingly waited until our neighbor returned from vacation. So they stole this washer from in front of their house. Upon their return, I learned the lesson they tossed it because it didn't dry well. Armed with that clue, I concentrated my troubleshooting efforts on the heating circuitry and determined that the heating element was still good. Since there was no obvious electrical damage, I took a chance and proceeded to install my new KitchenAid dishwasher. A few wash cycles later, it was confirmed that the heating element was not working. The onboard computer displayed an overtemp error code which disabled the heating element. A simple factory reset cleared the error code, and the heating element has been performing flawlessly ever since. Even at full price, we highly recommended this KitchenAid KDFE 104D SS2 dishwasher for its cleaning ability and low noise. He has some hints here. Hint 1, electrical schematics and or troubleshooting guides can typically be found behind the kick plate of most dishwashers. Be kind to your future self or the next homeowner by replacing these documents when finished. Hint 2, most big box stores sell an adapter elbow specifically marketed for retrofitting existing plumbing to a new dishwasher inlet. I think what he's talking about is they make a T that you put on top of a supply line, a normal 1/4-inch compression fitting that allows you to connect the dishwasher supply line to it without doing any additional plumbing work.
Yep.
Hint 3, do not confuse This Old Dishwasher podcast with Fine Home Dishwashers podcast. FHD is much more finer. Okay. This is from ChickenLips 412 in Chesapeake, Virginia. So there you have it. Is this someone you guys know? Are you gaming me on this? This is a fun question. Hello, enjoy the podcast. After surviving Snowvid 21 down here in Texas, I have a question for you. Almost everything down here has a slab on grade foundation, often with a concrete porch poured along with a slab. Up where y'all deal with this cold all the time are exterior concrete porches thermally broken from an insulated slab? And this is a really good question. So Joseph have observed that if you have a slab attached to your home slab, it is a huge path for conductive energy, right?
It's like basically a giant heat sink, like you got on your computer to cool it off, you know?
It's just radiating heat on the outside that's coming from the inside, right?
Yeah.
So do you guys, what are your thoughts? Do you think people consider this in their builds?
I would guess a lot of people don't think about it, but certainly any of the high performance home builders that we work with would do that. It's certainly the right way to do it. I don't know. I would guess that it's probably still pretty common to just pour it right up against the foundation. I mean, I know my house has a big concrete stoop poured against the brick foundation, and but of course this was long before insulated slabs.
Brian, what do you think? What do most people do?
Well, I don't know if the right answer is what most people do or what should be done.
Okay, let's start with what most people do.
Well, for one thing, not all, but a lot of the colder climate parts of the countries don't have slab on grade construction. Some do, but others have basements. And like Rob said, but it wasn't long ago that there's literally no insulation in or outside of basements, right? And still it's very minimal in your average home, the amount that a basement is being insulated. So whether it's in a cold climate, though, whether it's a slab or a basement, that's where your thermal boundary would need to be. So if you're pouring a concrete patio adjacent to that, your thermal boundary would stay at the edge of the slab for the house or the basement, and so that's where you would need your insulation.
You would need some kind of thermal break, need
thermal break there, yeah.
Which my assumption it would be some kind of rigid insulation because it has to be, unaffected by water, and it just is meant to slow that heat transfer.
Yeah.
So I have like a little tiny slab outside the lean-to doors on my barn, and before I poured that, I put a 1-inch piece of polystyrene between the barn slab and that little slab, and that's my thermal break. I meant to always put like a piece of pressure treated lumber over it to be a stop for the door and to hide it, but I haven't done that. So now I have this little band of pink foam, which is probably why most people don't do it correctly, because then it's a problem to hide that, right? Like if you had a patio right attached to your house, I don't know what you do to obscure that.
One thing you could do that is sort of a little bit of a compromise that is probably similar to how they used to do slabs for tile in bathrooms is you taper the top edge of the foam so that you're pouring your concrete right up against the slab for just a tiny sliver at the top where no one's going to step on it, but that you've got your concrete continuous right to the foundation.
Yeah, and we had we published on GBA. We published a house where there was a stem wall and then there was a slab poured inside the stem wall, and they found that what Rob just described, if you have to adjust the thickness of the thermal break of the rigid foam at the bottom, but what he just described, that tapered piece, if you adjust that, if you adjust the thickness of it at the bottom, can be comparable in as a thermal break to a rectangular shaped piece with an even thickness the whole way. So that's exactly what they did, so that they didn't have to find a way to bridge the exterior wall finish to the slab.
So let me paraphrase. If you make the thermal break triangular in cross section versus rectangular, you can put the skinny end at the top so your concrete goes all the way to the foundation.
Sure. Or even step it, make it just thicker by putting more layers at the bottom. So you've got a thick chunk at the bottom, Yeah,
and they modeled that. This was a passive house, so they had to model all of these things, and they modeled it and found out that it works just fine.
That is so awesome. I love science. This is a huge problem in high-rise buildings, right? With concrete balconies and concrete interiors. And I know you at Green Building Advisor, Brian, covered a product that is meant to decouple those two pieces of concrete. Do you remember what that is? I'm sure it would work in a residential setting, but it was a huge innovation for this kind of construction, I remember.
I don't remember what you're talking about.
Kylie actually featured that in one of her Houses by Design articles. There was a house that used that for some big cantilevered portions on the outside of the house. I think it was a metal canopy or something.
Oh, and that's right.
It was basically what it is there are these like I-beam shaped brackets that have a rigid structural piece of plastic as a thermal break inside them. So they're just like those deck brackets that look like little chunks of I-beams to put your ledger onto the house, but there's a layer in between the inner and outer flange that has a thermal break built into it.
Cool. So, Joseph, that was a great question. There is an answer. Unfortunately, most people are not thinking about that when they're, detailing this kind of stuff.
Yep. And retrofit, take out the gas saw, cut out a big chunk of your slab and throw some foam down there and pour some concrete over the top of it, right?
Even just, a separation, like if you could work that into the design, say if you made a separation and then had a step on top of it or something, that would solve the problem too, right?
Sure. Leaving an actual gap.
This is from Matt in Baltimore. In your most recent episode, you talked about a letter from someone who would open up a late wall in late winter to find it wet, sometimes so wet they could squeeze water out of the wood. Your solution was to put monitors in the walls. I guess I knew that sometimes would hold on to water during the winter, but it seems to me that bulk water in a wall cavity would be a definite problem, not just something to monitor. Am I wrong in this, or did you all just get a little sidetracked? I was hoping you could elaborate a little more on the tendency of walls to hold on to water in the colder months and get rid of it in the warmer months. I know an air barrier is the answer, but I concentrate on small remodeling jobs where I'm not addressing the entire house. Okay, so we're not talking about bulk water. We're talking about, what is the proper term? Adsorption, right, guys? You're talking about water moving through materials. And when it gets to someplace cold enough, it condenses. And of course, in a warming, heating climate, the sheathing is the cold part of the wall. And so once it gets there, it's going to show up as liquid water, not absorbed water. And so that's what is happening in the wintertime. And did we
So
get sidetracked on this?
no, well, I think he's pointing to something that's right. I mean, we did get onto monitoring so that we could so that people could know exactly how much walls are getting wet, and how much, and drying throughout the seasons. But he's right to point out that it's not monitoring is not the solution. The solutions are, first of all, proper roof overhangs, proper flashings, and water management on the exterior. The second most important solution is your air barriers, because air moves the second most, besides rain and snow melt, air moves the second most, the second highest concentration of water in the form of vapor riding on air. And then the third part of the solution is proper vapor, vapor management, and that's where your vapor profile of your wall comes in, and that's the trickier one for people to understand. You got to read the last issue of Fine Homebuilding to get even more confused about it. It's really a, I'm joking, but it's really such a nuanced thing, right? It's not like with there it is. With water, with rain and snow melt, it's an absolute thing. We do everything we can to keep it out of the wall. With air, it's an absolute thing. We do everything we can to keep it from moving through the assembly. With vapor, it's more nuanced. You need to, at certain times in certain climates, you need your best effort should be towards completely stopping vapor drive. For example, in the winter, in a cold climate, from the interior to the exterior, or the opposite in a heating climate. Sometimes you really want to just stop vapor from penetrating the interior from the exterior. I'm sorry, in a cooling climate, you want to just stop it from going inward. But stopping it is also problematic because walls need to dry. So vapor becomes much more nuanced and than the other two controls. So he's right. The solution to wetting is not monitoring.
Yeah.
Monitoring is to help us better understand how much of a problem a little bit of seasonal wetting is. And what the builders that are monitoring are finding out, that if they've taken care of those control layers, if they have a really smart assembly or a really old house, that a little bit of seasonal wetting is not problematic. The wall will take on some moisture in the winter, for example, and it will dry in the spring.
Yeah, and you touched on one thing, Brian, there that I think is super important to point out, is that it depends on the wall assembly itself and the layers within that wall. It's like we never think of these things as a single material, like you're adding a material to solve a problem. It's like the material has to be incorporated into the entire plan of the wall assembly. Like, for instance, if you have one of those vapor concerns is if you have a reservoir cladding, that's when you definitely need a barrier to prevent more vapor from permeating the wall from the outside. But there's wall assemblies that can handle vapor moving through them, and there's wall assemblies that can't. There's wall assemblies that, if you choose the wrong materials on the inside and the outside, you're just going to trap the moisture inside the wall. So it's like you kind of have to look at the big picture.
Yeah, and one of the best things you can do in either climate, in either a heating climate where you have where outward vapor drive is the most problematic, or a cooling climate where inward vapor drive is the most problematic, is a gap behind your siding, an airspace between your siding and your sheathing. So a rain screen assembly, because it just promotes drying of the materials. It gives the sheathing an easy drying path, and it gives the siding an easy drying path. So
the article that Brian just mentioned is called Successful Vapor Control by Jay Crandall and our friend Fernando Ruiz. It's really Fine Homebuilding's attempt to answer these issues in a comprehensive manner. There are assemblies drawn. There's a flow chart at the end of the article that shows you how to plan a robust wall assembly, no matter what you're using with regard to cladding. And I'm curious what y'all think, if it's a successful effort, because I think I took a few years off of my life working on this piece. But
well, we have the right author, right? Jay is, and Fernando, of course, helps us understand everything. But Jay is an engineer who has studied this particular subject for a long time and helped write the newest codes that for about vapor control, and he does feel like they're generally a step in the right direction. So the 2021 code will be updated in that department with some new stuff that is will certainly be helpful to the people who aren't going to take a deeper dive into understanding this. And
perhaps even more important, Jay makes the point that there were some potentially risky wall assemblies in prior code cycles. So
yes,
if you're building to prior editions of the IRC than the 2021, and I suspect that's everybody, you need to pay attention to this because there are some risky assemblies in the prior versions.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing about building science is that we understand a lot, but in practice, it's not always the same as it is in the lab, and we're learning new stuff every day. And so hopefully we'll get to a point where it's easy to build an assembly without as much risk, but there's always going to be a little bit,
Interestingly, a lot of Jay's information comes from testing or investigation in homes that were damaged by natural disasters, right? So when the house was already tore apart, they would go in and check out to see how it was performing. And so, I mean, in my mind, that's real world scenarios, which are often very different than lab conditions we've shown.
Yeah. So you're going to read the second half of that question?
Second, unrelated question. A few months ago, you had a letter on the podcast about insulating structural brick walls. For this, your answer was to leave the brick exposed because it looks nice. While this may be so, it's hardly a universal solution. I work mainly in Baltimore, where most of the houses are structural brick. Should these walls not be insulated so the brick can stay warm and not freeze and spall? And how does this relate to concrete block foundation walls? If I insulate them, do I run the risk of the mortar joints getting wet, freezing, and failing? I guess my question is, can I insulate a structural brick wall or a foundation wall, or should they be left uninsulated so they can stay warm? Thanks, Matt from Baltimore.
So the thing here is it's sort of like a weird balance that you have to walk. And one of the best resources I've found on this topic, and I've turned to it every time something like this comes up, is on Building Science Corporation's website. They have tons of those documents about how to detail just about every kind of wall assembly in every climate. And they've got one on interior insulation retrofits of load-bearing masonry walls in cold climates. And I'll put a link to that. But I'll just read a little quote from it. They were saying one successful approach involves spraying an airtight, semi-permeable insulating foam directly to the back of the existing masonry, but then the interior finishes must all have high vapor permeance or be back vented. And the whole idea is that you want to insulate the space, but not so much that it's going to cause freeze-thaw damage on the outside of the house or the building. And then you also want to allow moisture that's in that mass wall to migrate out of the wall by having vapor permeable layers on the inside, or similar to what Brian was saying earlier about claddings, even having an air gap between the insulation and some of the interior layers.
It's a complicated question, and like many building science questions, it depends, right? It depends on how cold is the cold climate. I'd say Baltimore is less risky than other places. Does it have overhangs? Does it have good parapets if there are no overhangs? Like all these things are going to load up the masonry, and if it gets cold enough, it's going to spall. Why you don't insulate the walls is you want the interior heat to keep the wall warm so it doesn't freeze even on the exterior. And so if you insulate it and keep it colder, the risk goes up. And I don't know if like Woofy modeling can predict this or others modeling scenarios.
Yeah, unfortunately, some buildings, if they're really risky because of the outside having a really high load of moisture and the temperatures getting really low, maybe you wouldn't actually leave the brick exposed. But if you go in a really cold climate in a really delicate building, you just really might not be able to insulate. But then that's why you see in the UK they might just plaster the inside of a wall like that or stucco the inside of a wall like that if they don't like the look of the brick.
Something I learned was that mass walls are incredibly air leaky, and you don't think masonry can leak air, but maybe it's a better approach is to put some kind of coating on the interior that you can live with that stops that, allows vapor to drying in the right season and slows it in the wrong season, and still keeps the wall somewhat warm and improves energy efficiency because you're stopping air leaks.
Yeah. You know who we should really ask about this stuff is our friends
Michael
in Brooklyn. Yes.
Yeah.
Because he deals with all those old multi-story row houses, the brownstones in New York City all the time. And they're doing those things to passive level standards, which means they're actually having to really think hard about exactly the thing we're talking about.
I wonder though, I've only really read about this issue with brick. I haven't read much about it or heard much about failures with other types of masonry materials. So I wonder if that is because of the size of bricks and the amount of mortar joints.
And their porosity. I think it entirely matters with the porosity.
And their sensitivity to the freeze-thaw. Like I know like softer sedimentary rock, like brownstone, those brownstone buildings, sandstone, they definitely have the same problems.
Yeah.
It's a good question, and I bet it's a recurring one at GBA, right, Brian?
Well, we've got a pretty in-depth article that Martin wrote a while back on this topic, and he worked with Steve Rick on it and a few other building scientists. And even at the end of that article, there's some ideas, but there's no one answer, right? And it is like, it's more about it's understanding the risks and understanding that yes, the risks. The colder the climate, the greater the risks. And, as you get into more mild and mixed climates, those risks are much less significant. But it's a squirrely one.
I would say the safest thing is to not insulate them or insulate them on the outside, but nobody wants to do that because people like brick buildings. And I think that was the point we were making earlier, Matt. Hey there. I also posted this on the FHB forum, but I figured I would ask the gang as well. I live just north of Vancouver, Canada. I'm in the process of slowly renovating and repairing a new to me 1960s 1,100 square foot single story bungalow / rancher. I don't know what the difference is, perhaps just local vernacular. Well, I would say those are two totally different things. Wouldn't you guys agree? A rancher and a bungalow are two totally different architectural styles.
Yeah, but I think people get them confused too because they're both one-story small buildings typically.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't bungalows story and a half traditionally?
Not necessarily.
They're both. I mean, there's even two-story. People still call them bungalows because they have the same sort of craftsman-esque details, and but yeah, I think they're often a story and a half.
And a rancher is, I would describe as all one story, usually with a lower slope roof, often wide overhangs, kind of flat.
Well, and rancher with the is a pretty regional term, right? You hear that term in California, parts of Canada, but in the middle of the country, and as you get towards the east of the country, they're just called ranches, and there's 2-level ranches and there's split-level ranches. So these terms just they evolve. They quickly evolve. So, but
I think developers change names based on what's currently in fashion, right? Like, oh no, this isn't a split level, this is a double ranch.
Oh yeah, and realtors just look for really clear ways to simplify it's a colonial. That basically just means it's a 2-story house with an
entry in the center, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. It's built on a 2-foot crawl space that needs serious weatherization work. I need to insulate the CMU walls, rim joists, insulate the ducting, and add a new vapor barrier, maybe radon mitigation, and maybe a dehumidifier, but there are other issues I think I should tackle first. The 3-row CMU blocks are unfilled, as I can stick things down the cores with a small space I can reach from the crawl space. Also, I've looked, but it doesn't seem as though the mud sills are anchored to the block foundation in any way. This was also noted by the home inspector before we purchased it. I think I should place anchors into the foundation wall at this area because it's very seismically active. Perhaps at the same time that build it wasn't code required, or the building codes may have not been enforced in this area at the time. It's hard to access in the summer, and especially when there's a 3-ferry sailing wait.
Must be hard to get materials to where he lives.
My question is, should I fill the block foundation fully with non-shrink construction grout or just fill the vertical core sections at the code prescribed anchor bolt spacing? It won't be a fun job, but at least a small section of the top of the core is accessible. I could drill a 3/4 inch hole in the top pore space and use a grout pump gun. I could also drill a hole at the bottom section of the cores to allow for air to escape and to indicate when the core is full. I'm a ticketed carpenter by day and a serial remodeler by night and weekend. This is just the beginning of a very large project, including a 20 by 26 garage addition, a new roof structure on the entire home that will include a green roof section and a PV array down the road. This may have to wait due to lumber prices rising 200% in the last year. So expect more questions. Any insight is appreciated. Tim. So I grew up in Pittsburgh where block foundations are the norm, and I can't explain regionally why one is common and, block versus concrete versus the other. But concrete block cores are not routinely filled in basements in Pittsburgh. Yeah, sometimes they are, especially if you have unstable soils or intense soil pressure from steep slopes. But ordinarily, especially a crawl space, because it's short, doesn't have to have the cores filled. But it's up to your engineer and your soil conditions, I would say. If you're in a seismically active area, it's a whole different ball of wax because you need to keep the foundation so the house stays on top. And if you don't have anchor bolts, that is a bigger problem because it'll shake the house right off the foundation. Even high winds can cause this kind of damage we've seen in the Midwest with tornadoes.
But it seems like I would certainly check with some local building officials or engineers to see what's common, because I'm sure there's plenty of other houses that are like that in that area. And I don't know if we're in any position over here on the East Coast to give people advice on how to detail seismic connections in their houses. A lot of houses, I'm not saying this is the case with something like this, but a lot of buildings are built to allow for movement when there's seismic activity. So I'm not saying I would want my house to shake off the foundation, but
I hope you're not saying that.
But I don't know. There might be a more appropriate ceconnecting method in there.
There is, and we have a great article, Protect Your Home with a basic seismic retrofit. You can find it at finehomebuilding.com, and it was written by a West Coaster where they deal with these issues all the time, and it's tackling a lot of what he's asking about.
Coincidentally, bungalows, which were built, at the turn of the century into probably the 40s and 50s in Southern California, routinely were not connected to their pony walls or foundations. And this is the work that this guy does, right, Brian?
Yeah, exactly. And you need anchor bolts, and you need them in the right places. You need the right amounts of them. And then there's other hardware too, just for adding. There's different types of tie downs that you can use in tight spaces, because a retrofit can be a lot more challenging than building a new house. You might not have access to where you need the bolts. So there's some like sort of clips that you can put on the, connect to the front of your wall plates, and that will then they kind of wrap around and anchor to the foundation. And there's all sorts of solutions for this. And you also, another thing in seismic zones, another thing is to make sure that you have appropriate shear strength, which is, and those requirements are greater in a true seismic zone than they are in other places. So I would check out that article. And if for no other reason than if he's going to do some of this work, there's great hardware ideas in there for working in an existing crawl space and an existing building.
Like you said, Ryan, this work is commonly done in a retrofit environment, and Simpson makes special products to attach houses to their foundations when they weren't built that way. And yeah. I don't think it's an accident, because Simpson is in California where this is a huge problem, right?
So any recommendations for how to attach my 8-inch rough-hewn beams to my rubble foundation?
Epoxy.
But I put the link to that article in the show notes. So
cool.
It's a cool thing. I'm sure it's dirty, hard work, but the improvements have been demonstrated to really work. Like these things do help in earthquakes.
Yeah, and then I just want to comment about his one other comment about his note is like, don't wait on that radon system. If you have high levels of radon, put that right on the top of your list with this seismic retrofit. Even if you don't do the whole crawl space, that system's a very affordable thing to put in, especially if you're doing the work yourself. And it's not going to be affected by lumber prices. So I would suggest getting that done as soon as possible.
Agreed. And I would say skip the green roof. It's a very, very expensive way to make a mediocre roof, is everything I've heard about it. And it's not good for the plants either. It's not how plants grow. They need water, like all the time.
We've heard since like the early earth bermed and solar house days, like people talking about using earth as insulation, but it has a pretty low insulation value. I mean, yeah, maybe it might be an extra layer, but I mean, you think about all the layers you have to put in order to protect the rest of your house from the fact that you have soil and living organisms covering the entire top of it. If you've already got like a nice flat roof commercial building and you can put some of those tray systems out, that's one thing, but starting from scratch, I'm not sure if I would recommend
it. Makes me sad to tell people not to do this, because I think it's super cool looking, but just like everything I hear about it is just nothing but problems.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you guys like them? Would you?
I mean, I think
we only see them on commercial buildings, right? But what do you think? Is it cool?
Well, one of the things that you really have to consider is that if you're not a gardener already and you don't appreciate the fact that, like, yeah, you could find some succulents that can handle sort of dry conditions. I mean, if you didn't use succulents, you'd have to have some sort of irrigation system or live in a really wet location, and getting plants to survive on green roofs is challenging. I think people. I shouldn't totally knock it, because I'm sure that the sort of information that's available on this has come a long way as people have actually built these things and sort of fine-tuned systems. So I'd say if you really are dead set on it, certainly do a lot of research on not just the systems to protect the house, but actually the systems to get things to grow on, because it's a pretty harsh condition. You're basically building like an alpine garden, so you're probably going to be sticking to plants that grow in like rocky crags in mountaintops if you want it to be low maintenance.
Yeah, and in the Pacific Northwest, you get seasonal rain, but you also get seasonal dryness. Like the things that do good in really wet conditions are not the same things that do really well in the summer dry season.
Yeah.
Do you like them, Brian?
No. Of course they're cool. It's a neat thing. I've seen some buildings with them it was sort of inspirational, especially where maybe there's a second story that looks out onto that flat roof, or I've seen somewhere people can actually walk right out onto it with a walkway. And that's really great. It's lovely for the people who have the money to build that and the time to sit home and garden it. But as a practical solution for homes, I'm not even remotely close. Hey, if it's a hobby, if this is your house, if you're living in this house for the rest of your plan is to live there for the rest of your life, this is your hobby, doing stuff like that, great. Knock yourself out, have fun. But I think we tend to be focused on some people would disagree with this, I'm sure, but we tend to be focused on what's practical, what's going to build durable, long-lasting homes for the most people and be remodelable and somewhat affordable. And these kind of priorities don't necessarily jibe, in my view, with a vegetative roof,
especially given it's really easy to put a garden on the ground, whatever you want to grow.
Right.
If your priority, if your priority is environmental, and then certainly you'll enjoy the garden much more. You'll actually be able to maintain it much easier. I mean, focus on smart landscaping practices as opposed to sticking your landscape on your roof.
some of the it's interesting to see on GBA we get a lot of commenters that are starting to and we there, as anyone who's been on GBA knows, very very smart audience. It's and so we just get great comments, and it's been interesting to see how many people are turning towards, if you really care about environmental issues, save money on your house and donate that money or use that money towards other causes. And so I've been kind of more intrigued by like looking at that a little bit, and what that means. And of course, we all work on our houses, we all care about our houses, and so it's the place where we can make an impact. But where do you sort of draw that line? When is it actually useful to put PV on your house? When is it useful actually to pay for utility scale PV? It's not. These just aren't easy equations to figure out. But I don't think
personal. They're based on your own values, right? It's like what.
And they might be based on your own. They might just not. They're going to be, if you look enough at the information, they're going to be based in facts. But you also have to make those decisions. And something like I just don't see something like a green roof being. And if it's not a hobby, if it's not just something you're really doing because you're passionate about it, you think it's beautiful, or it's going to improve the quality of your life to that degree, I don't see it as tipping the scale.
I agree.
Well, so on a related note, something that I may have even mentioned on a podcast in past years, I put a question on GBA forum one time, and it was about some convoluted idea I had about exterior insulation and air barrier retrofit on my extremely complicated big old house. And Martin Holliday, the one thing that stood out in one of his responses to me was he's like, sometimes there's just like, you can make a good argument for not doing anything at all and spending more time fishing and hiking, It's like, and so it's like, I could certainly do a major insulation retrofit on my house and spend thousands and thousands of dollars, even doing all the labor myself, and make my house, marginally more comfortable. And the thing is, I enjoy doing that kind of work, so I may still chip away at it over time, like that wall I did on the back of the kitchen. But he's got a point. It's like, I've been a slave to this house for 20 years, and it's like sometimes I'd like to have my weekends to myself,
Yeah, or you take the money you spent on, foam insulation and go to the Caribbean for a couple weeks in the coldest parts of the winter, right? Yeah. So we got a really interesting question from Jeremy. Hi, FHB crew. Your content in all formats is extremely valuable and appreciated, so much so that I've begun requiring everyone in our company to read an FHB article or watch an FHB video each week. This has been great for advancing everyone's mindset and technical abilities. However, those on our crews who speak English as a second language find it difficult to obtain the full value of FHB's content because of their language barrier. They often understand the how-to, but not the why. And I have found in the construction industry that if the whys aren't understood, then the likelihood of things being done improperly increases. This is especially true with respect to the more intangible aspects of building science. Do you guys have any recommendations for non-English sources that provide the same quality of information provided by FHB, GBA, or JLC? Thanks, Jeremy. And Rob, we talked a little bit ahead of the show. We won't belabor it, but honestly, it's hard to find those materials. But you found something, Rosetta Stone, is that what you said?
Yeah, so if you go to Rosetta Stone, business.rosettastone.com, that's their enterprise solutions. So it's not just that casual, like learn Spanish in your spare time kind of thing. They actually have a whole course that includes live tutoring services for Spanish for construction workers. Now, I think this is geared more towards people who are managing construction and have Spanish-speaking workers working for them. But I'd be curious to dig a little deeper and see if they have sort of the flip side, that they have the programs directly geared towards the construction workers that are Spanish native speakers themselves. Honestly, as far as magazines or books go, I think Hanley Wood used to have a Nuevo Constructor, but that's no longer in print. And even going to some of the sort of Latino construction associations, I was surprised to not find any sort of resources in that regard there for teaching construction skills, construction terminology to Spanish-speaking workers. But
so what we decided was that we're going to ask you all if you know of any of those resources that can help. I would love to learn about them, and we could pass them on to Jeremy. And I'm sure there's other folks in the same boat. So we talked about the recent issue already, but there's a really cool article in there written by John Carroll, who's a longtime contributor to Fine Homebuilding and author of 2 popular books. And on a related note, Ian Schwant has agreed to interview John Carroll for an upcoming anniversary podcast. So those 2 will be on, and I look very much forward to hearing Ian interview our esteemed contributor, John Carroll. But John Carroll is still contributing to the magazine decades later and recently did a piece on brick arches. And it was super awesome, but you also saw a pretty super awesome technique for building with masonry, right, Rob?
Well, actually, I think it was Matt who you, me, and Matt were texting one morning, and you guys were like, "Hey, this is this better than John Carroll's method?" And it was like a TikTok or Instagram video that showed a couple of guys who had basically shimmed up a truck tire that was exactly the diameter. The diameter of the truck tire was exactly the width of the arch that these people were forming. And they just kind of jammed it into the brick wall and were using that to form up the brick arch on the top. So I imagine if you have, if you go to your local tire store and they've got, they have to pay to get rid of those things. If you could probably find the right diameter if you pick through the pile for whatever arch size you're building, and
and you could go to tractor tires or whatever if you wanted something bigger. It seemed pretty cool. It's goofy, but it looked like it actually wasn't a bad idea, because what's the alternative? You have to take the time to carefully build the arch out of plywood and some blocking to build a wooden form for your arch, right? So hey, if you got a ready-made form, just grab and go. Why not? It was brilliant. People in the developing world have to figure out ways to do things with nothing, and I think it's pretty cool.
That's a really good point, Patrick, because me, I'm into welding and building cars and bikes and stuff, and I find, if you find an example of a video of people in Mexico and Central America where they have to work with, or really anywhere on the world that's in a limited resource environment, they have to make do with whatever materials and tools are at hand. And there was a time when this country, I think, was more like that in more rural areas, when people didn't have Amazon and the local Sears store to buy their tools, that you'd have to sort of make do. And in fact, there's actually a great magazine called Farm Show, which just showcases people around the U.S. Taking old tractor parts and making new equipment for them. And it's definitely,
I don't see what's appealing to you about that, Rob.
There's definitely people everywhere doing this sort of thing. But hey, I love the idea of taking materials or tools or parts or whatever and repurposing them, because why not, rather than throwing them in the recycling bin or the dump.
Amen. Do you guys have anything to? Well, Rob's done. Do Brian and Jeff? Do you have anything to say before we go?
Nope.
I'm going to make appeal for folks to subscribe to the website, subscribe to the magazine, subscribe to both. But your contributions to the fund here help keep us on the air and keep the company going. So it's important work we do here, and I hope you all appreciate it, and will help us out by getting a subscription to the website or the magazine. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Brian, Rob, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. Please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks very much for listening. Happy building. Keep craft alive.